You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network, and this is episode 350 of the Talking Headways Podcast.
Talking headways, keep moving on, keep moving on. Talking headways, keep moving on, keep moving on. Talking headways, keep moving on, keep moving on.
This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Tufts Professor Justin Hollander. Justin chats with us about a wide range of topics, including VMT taxes, using eye tracking software to measure the impacts of the built environment on people's minds, and he reacts to the most recent census release. Stay with us. You may have noticed a bit different music. That's for two reasons. First is that this is the 350th episode of Talking Headways. We started this thing in 2013 and have been rocking it ever since. So we thought it'd be fun and good to do something a little bit different at the halfway mark to 400. But also, second reason, my desktop computer crashed and so the regular music is locked away, especially that peppy beat we used for episodes 200 and 300. So enjoy this ditty and thanks for listening as always. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. The fall is almost here, so get one to warm your transit-loving heart today. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire, including our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, Read Around the World. We pull the best news about cities from around the web and share them with readers each morning. It's the best newsletter in the business, so try us out for free by going to theoverheadwire.com. You'll also find links to buy the scarf as well as our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning in Practice. Go to theoverheadwire.com to find out more. Well, Justin Hollander, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on the show. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I have been an urban planner for about 15 years. And most recently, I've been a professor. I've been teaching at Tufts University. And I do research and write. And yeah, happy to talk to you about my experiences.
And how did you get interested in cities? And were you always on this track to be interested in cities and urban design and all these things?
For a long time, yes. So yeah, my father's an architect. So like all that stuff was kind of like all around in our family. And he would always talk about buildings when we would be outside. So I kind of started with that. I played SimCity as a kid, and I was like, "This is a job! Oh my god, this is great!" And it's actually, as it turns out, real planning is even more fun than the video game.
Well, you can't just leave it on overnight and accumulate massive amounts of money either. But which one did you play? I think the last one I did was SimCity 2000 was the last SimCity I played, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah, actually, I played the original. Just classic. Yeah, I tried the 2000. I didn't like it. So.
Didn't like it as much? No. What about City Skylines? I know that's a popular one. We actually had the game designer on.
Yeah. People talk about that. Things have kind of gotten a little more busy in my life, and my wife has told me I'm not allowed to play computer games. Otherwise, things like, the garbage doesn't go out and, things start to pile up. So, yeah, so that's...
You have your own SimCity to take care of.
Right. Got it.
Well, I wanted to have you on to talk about a number of things as you're such a prolific writer. But let's start with a piece in The Hill that you wrote recently about why you believe we shouldn't tax VMT and should instead raise the gas tax. What prompted you to write this piece?
Yeah, so before the recent infrastructure bill passed the Senate, this idea of incorporating a VMT program had been floated about 6 months ago by the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. And he went around and he was like talking about this program that he was, with a straight face, telling everybody that instead of raising the gas tax, let's create this massive government program that is essentially like an invasion of people's privacy, installing recording devices on their cars, and then generate income to pay for the federal highway and other transportation investments through that. So I don't know. I was just so mad. That's a lot of where my writing and research comes from. Just being angry. Here we have a mechanism. We have a mechanism, and really the only rationale that he came up with to justify this was that people who drive hybrids and electric cars aren't paying their fair share. And, for decades, we've been using the largesse of the federal treasury to subsidize and encourage people to buy and drive electric and hybrid cars. And now he's like turning on these people. So that was really the kind of challenge that really got to me and that motivated me to write that.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that we talk about on the show is how we need to kind of reduce VMT overall from vehicles because of the particulates from tires and brake dust. We have these like microparticles that end up, for example, like billions of them have been counted in the San Francisco Bay. Wouldn't a VMT tax help with that goal of reducing overall VMT?
Well, I'm not saying that there's no room for it to be effective. And I've, throughout my career as a planner and as an academic, I have worked very hard to try to create communities and try to provide incentives to reduce VMT. I mean, you're right that people should be driving less. There's no question about that. But as it turns out, the gas tax is a really great way to encourage people to drive less. And so, as we look at providing federal funding to be able to make the necessary transportation investments and enhancements, the gas tax is a great way to generate that. The system's already in place. There are other things that we can do more like at the state and local level to reduce VMT. And that's really around local zoning, subdivision control regulations, different types of state policies around infrastructure investments, just helping to provide incentives for people to live closer to where they live and where they play. And so that's going to reduce VMT. But to create this massive government program that's going to either put devices in people's cars or require them to fill out some sort of special form on their taxes that's based on a log that tells the government how many miles they drove. There's just this perverse redundancy, in my opinion, because that's already essentially being collected through the gas tax.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't be against it necessarily. I think most of the idea that I see would be, kind of like smog checks where you read the odometer every year, the person sees it, and then that's it. And then you have the tax written on that. But there's probably obviously room for fraud and grift and those types of things that we see. Also, the gas tax is something that hasn't been increased since 1992. And I think a lot of urban issue related folks would agree that needs to be raised. But for some reason, we can't even get there. And this year was kind of it was just a weird thing to see all these years people talking about raising the gas tax and then saying that it's off the table because it's included in, Biden's promise not to raise taxes on anybody who makes under $400,000.
Right. No taxes, no matter what. No.
Under $400,000. So it's
Right.
like, well, that's really weird. And like you said, we're already taking money from the general fund to pay for transportation. It's not like the gas tax is actually paying for everything in the road building era. But it's interesting to see kind of the both sides of what the discussions are and how things have flipped. And yesterday, we actually heard the news that the last gas station selling leaded gasoline in the world stopped operating. So I'm amazed that lasted this long. So it kind of gives us an indication, I feel like, how hard it's going to be to get rid of gasoline if we can't even get rid of the lead that we know is bad for people in gasoline. I think it was in Algeria or something like that. It wasn't in the US, so we've banned lead in the gas a long time ago because of the negative effects. But it's just interesting to have that discussion. And then, so the other piece that caught my attention was Jared Green's Dirt article on your APA virtual conference presentation. And you've been doing a lot of research on the built environment. How much does design impact human well-being?
A ton. Really, really, so much more than we understand, I think, when you look at the way that planning functions on a daily basis in jurisdictions all over the country, all over the world. There's really this kind of built-in framework that we all draw on that suggests that there's some sort of kind of like objective reality of what it means to design places, and that, we want to try to create places that provide some sort of economic use or social value, environmental. But so much of what's missing is the human experience, and that what we need to really value. And I hope that the kind of silver lining of the pandemic is kind of new orientation around health and well-being, that we need to value people's well-being, and that the design of the built environment has a major impact on how people's physiologically, how they respond to the places that they see. Our discussion earlier about VMTs, I mean, there's certainly a lot of people who've been interested in to what extent a place is pedestrian friendly, makes people want to walk, then they won't drive as much, so that's healthy. But it's much deeper than that, and that's some of the stuff that we talked about in that paper, in that presentation at the APA.
Yeah, I was just so fascinated. I read it and I was like, this is different. And I'd seen stuff about cognitive, thinking about architecture and that. But I just, the way you're doing the research and putting together the data from people's experiences through technology that allows people to watch where the eyes are going on a picture or an outdoor experience is really fascinating. I mean, your research shows that we only are aware of about 5% of our cognitive responses to the built environment, yet there's that other 95% that is, I'm guessing, internal.
Right. So it's happening automatically. Think about it like you get up in the morning, you get out of bed, and you walk down the hall, right? You're not thinking about putting one foot in front of the other. It's all happening automatically. And it's the same thing with your heart beating and breathing. These things are happening automatically. So this is what we talk about, this idea that the mind is like an iceberg with only a very small percentage is peeking out that you kind of we're aware of, that we know about, but everything else is happening. Your body is responding to everything around it. And frankly, it's just beyond our capability to even understand how it can do that. I mean, imagine if you had to be conscious and aware of all of those things that are happening automatically, you can never function. That's why babies have such a hard time crawling and stuff. I mean, because that those skills haven't been developed yet. So yeah, so when we design a street, a plaza, a park, when we design buildings, we need to have that in the forefront. We need to recognize that people are responding to these places at that kind of subliminal level first. That's how they're first responding. And then the fact that they might later think, oh, this building actually looks familiar. Oh, or I think I've been down the street before. That's later. And that's, of course, that's fine. And we can build those kinds of ideas into design. But the automatic response, that's something that affects us very deeply in terms of a health and well-being way. And it's been essentially absent from our conversations in planning and architecture.
How does it impact us? I mean, when something you see is negative, does it raise your heart rate? Does it cause you to faint? What does it do to you physically when you have that response that you don't quite understand maybe?
Yeah, you're right. Our heart rate, there are a number of different indicators of stress. I mean, people have done research where they've looked at brainwave activity, EEG, and there's certain brainwaves that are indicating that someone's relaxed, or some that indicate that the person's stressed. And so a galvanic skin response measures electrical activity on the surface of your skin. And that's also suggesting that you're stressed out or upset. So these kinds of things are all telling us that there's something wrong, and that this is not a good thing for a human to be so upset and worried. The other thing about, you mentioned the eye tracking, that's also going to help us indicate a little bit about stress, but there's something even deeper for the urban design experience, which is it tells us where the eye will go first in an urban scene, which if a person's disoriented, that's really important for wayfinding. So it'll help us understand if the person will see the door in a building or will see the sidewalk in a busy area. Will they know where to go? So then the other piece is, if there's nothing for them to see, if they're disoriented, then we can infer that will make them stressed out and upset, and can make them not want to be in that place anymore, or make them want to just get in their car and just drive away as opposed to explore and walk around.
And this is an experience that I think people have, but they don't quite realize. I mean, there's this whole new districts of buildings in the United States, usually urban renewal districts just outside of downtown, where these glass towers and kind of square buildings are constructed. And people, maybe it just doesn't feel quite right to them. And maybe they don't understand why, but maybe you can explain that through how people's responses are in those tests that you do.
Definitely. One of the things that I've been really interested in, especially using the eye tracking, is that when someone does look at a scene or a place where there's buildings that have certain characteristics, and some of the stuff that I've done in my research is bilateral symmetry, where the left and the right side are mirror images, hierarchy, where there's like a top, middle, and bottom, curves. So when they look at these things and they see these and they fixate on them, so their eye really hones in and stays on that, whether it's a building facade or an edge or a part of a plaza. When they do that, the neuroscientists tell us that they remember it. We remember when we make those fixations. So we connect with the place, things that we remember. I mean, memory is very much, a big part of the human experience. So when you build a place where nobody can connect with it, where there's nothing to fixate on, you're likely going to be failing. That's the place that people aren't going to want to go to, and they're not going to remember, and they're not going to go back. So I think you're right that people have these experiences and they don't even know why. And so now we're starting to be able to understand why. We have some of these really powerful biometric tools that gives us those measurements. And it's really opening up a whole new kind of discipline within planning.
The built environment memory hole sounds like
Right.
something along those lines.
Right.
And one of the things that always tickles me is when we try to anthropomorphize things, or give human characteristics to things, everything from manhole covers, exhaust vents, and even building. Why do we do that?
Well, actually, scientists have a name for it. It's called Paradoia. And Paradoia is essentially a condition where we, when we're born, are looking for a face or human body because we're looking to connect with our mother. And so it's something that is built into us. It's part of our DNA. And so looking for these faces, looking for bodies, that's something we're always doing. And we're always actually literally scanning the environment constantly, looking for those faces. And so to the extent that faces are in the facades of buildings or in our streetscapes and our parks, then we will be attracted to them and we will remember them. We will want to go back to them. I mean, look at some of the most famous buildings in the world. They tend to look like faces or look like a body. Many of them literally have statues or have some sort of face-like arrangements on their facades. So this is like a big part of like traditional or vernacular architecture and design. And so maybe they knew it better than we do today. but so much of what in my research, I'm trying to like kind of remind people that there's this history there that maybe they knew something that we don't know.
Yeah, I guess that's why people like clock towers so much.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And why are we connected to streets that are designed like corridors? Why have we designed away from that affinity in suburbs or on arterial streets, for example? We tend to like streets that are corridors or in an urbanism that has kind of a reference point at the end.
Right. Well, I first learned about the importance of corridors in Kevin Lynch's work. In Image of a City, he talks about the importance of corridors and edges. But if you go back to the end of the 19th century, scientists had already identified this as a scientific concept called thigmotaxis. And that's actually a Greek word, means to touch. So this need for wall hugging was something that scientists have seen in other species. They've seen it in dozens of species. And only about 15 years ago was the first research that showed empirically that humans, just like basically any other creature in the animal kingdom, also are thigmotactic, and that we look for these edges and we have this wall hugging behavior. Now there's different theories about why, but the fact is that this is something that through billions of years of evolution, there's been an advantage. So over the period of evolution, this is a trait that's been conserved. And so we as humans have the same trait. It's worked. We're still here. And so there's some sort of advantage and likely about, protecting us from predators. I think you might want to guess, but that's the idea.
I wonder if that's why I like forests better than beaches. Beaches seem to be wide open,
right? You're exposed
in spaces,
right?
Versus forests, I feel connected to the trees. Maybe that's it. But a lot of people like beaches too, so I don't know if that explains much. When you're doing this research and you're using this software that follows people's eyes on an image, is there something counterintuitive that you found out about their reactions or what they're seeing from the data that you get back?
Well, we just did a study pretty recently, and the thing that was really most shocking was that, and then we did this in Boston, and these two parts of the Back Bay neighborhood. Newbury Street is kind of a famous street, And we wanted to see kind of how do people respond differently in Newbury Street versus Beacon Street, which is not quite so pedestrian oriented, a lot more of those kinds of newer, taller glass buildings. And what was really shocking was that it was the cars that people noticed the most, both parked cars and the driving cars. And so, I mean, I feel like as a planner, I mean, of course, we all, planners know cars are awful and they're evil, right? I mean, like, it's a well-known fact, but we must live with them. We must find a way to accommodate them. But to see the biometrics showing it in such, bold phase, that was really the most surprising thing that we've seen.
It's really interesting. We're hopefully going to have Megan Ryerson on from the University of Pennsylvania to come on the show to talk about safety at intersections, because they just released research on this using some similar technologies that follow people's neurostress. Have you seen other ways outside of design that this research can be impactful on the built environment or even transportation generally?
Yeah, well, I edited this book and we had a chapter where they were using an eye tracker on bicyclists. And so this was a study where they were able to show how eye trackers can be a powerful way to understand when a bicyclist approaches the intersection, what do they see? And so, there's so much support for share rows and segregated bike lanes. But this kind of study, shows that, I mean, it's just so dangerous because the bicyclists on a subliminal level, as they're approaching the intersection, I mean, it's just total chaos. So having that dedicated lane is just really critical.
There are certain streets that are great that aren't necessarily kind of new urban. They have good fenestration, or maybe they have ground floor retail that has a lot of books and things in the windows. How do those work from our brain's perspective? Have you looked at the difference between kind of a traditional architecture versus more urban architecture that's still somewhat pleasing to people?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really done a study that gets at that exact question, though I think it's a really interesting one. There's like this kind of really powerful idea about permeability in, an urban setting. So as you're walking on that sidewalk, to what extent do you feel like connected to what's behind the wall, right? Or you're talking about if you see books, that is what you mean, like the books are like behind in the window?
In the window,
Right.
or like just like, if you're going down a retail street, there's just stuff in the windows.
Right.
I guess it's the stuff that takes your eye rather than the window itself.
Yeah, and I think that you're right that the most important thing is that we are stimulated visually, and that we need that stimulation as we kind of are walking down the street. So, if the choices are between urban scene where it's the windows with books behind it versus more of a kind of traditional urban scene, maybe where it's brick or some other kind of decorated walls and beautiful fenestration, there will be differences, no question. But the big thing is you don't want to just be a blank wall, or if it's going to be glass, you don't want it to be opaque in any kind of way, like tinted. So I think that's what we need. We need that stimulation, the visual stimulation and complexity. And that's something that I've definitely seen in my research.
Another thing I wanted to get your reaction to was there was a Pew Research Study released in the last few days that was covered a little bit in media, saying that 60% of Americans would rather live in a big house far away from commercial areas. Of course, the question was binary, and small houses and walkable areas were the other side of the question, which is kind of silly, but in my opinion. But if we look at the preference and take it at face value from this survey, why would people choose that specific choice if urban places make us happier? I'm curious if you saw this or if this is something that you all have thought about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've definitely thought about this question, and I teach a class at Tufts on real estate development, and what I think that you're kind of getting at is that there's a difference between how we respond to places subliminally versus how we might answer a survey. And the kind of questions that are asked in a survey are not engaging us at that kind of emotional, subliminal, unconscious way. They're engaging our intellect. And the fact is that there's a lot going on in our intellect. We're always thinking about all kinds of different things. And sometimes there's a social desirability bias that's built in there. Sometimes it's about trying to respond to some sort of like political agenda. We're trying to figure out, well, what does the survey author want? So I think, though, the other piece of it is the real estate development side, which is that there is definitely legitimate demand for large homes far from everyone else, like very kind of private. And so from a real estate development perspective, there's no question that that's a lot of the building that's been going on in the last 10 or 20 years in the United States. So there's demand for that and people are buying that. And the reason they're buying it is because it's easier for the developers to build than the kind of more urban infill type development, right? So that's what's being made available. But I think if you wanted to, Pew did a better job, they would essentially show an image. And the two images would be, one would be in an urban setting close to other uses, and it would be exactly the same building, but more remote. And I think what you would see if those two images presented, I think the people would more likely to click on the more urban setting if it's more responding to the kind of the subliminal kind of what would be most preferable to them, what they would like more. But that's not how they're asking the question. So I think what's going on is that what the market is producing is that more kind of remote product.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's interesting you mentioned that political part too, because a lot of the responses to the survey was that, we've made walking political. And I can understand that. There's a whole, thread of thinking about politics and cities and how we've built freeways and how there's a bifurcation of urban versus rural areas in political thought. And, I even in my newsletter, I even had a little piece about this. And even on the podcast last week, I even had a piece about this, how we're not different in the United States from European areas because the rural and the urban areas seem to be kind of bifurcating from each other, separating from each other, whereas the big cities in like London, Paris, and maybe Milan are more like New York City and San Francisco and larger cities than they are maybe their rural areas. And the rural areas are more like each other than the countries themselves. And so it's starting to kind of split this apart. But that's a really interesting point about the politics of answering surveys even. If you gave people, a transect of sorts of this urban design and showed them pictures, I think like kind of the pictures that you're showing people with the eye following software, you might get a different response. And so I kind of, threw the survey out halfway thinking about it because I was like, well, this is a binary question and it's silly. But at the same time, it continues to kind of backfill this tribalism, this idea of suburban versus urban, whereas there's a continuum, as you know, and I think as the listeners know for sure, there's a continuum. But it's interesting to see a place like Pew go this way and have this type of a survey where there's a binary question and it's not more nuanced, which I think a lot of times we're missing the nuance in our discussions.
Yeah. There's this idea of in survey design forced category bias. You're forcing someone to pick these two. I mean, they might not really know the difference. And if it was me, I would want to know, well, is there central air conditioning? Is there like a place to park? I mean, like what's in the neighborhood, schools? Right? There's so many questions. How far from work? If the rural one's closer to work, doesn't that matter? So I think you're just essentially forcing someone to choose, and then they're trying to draw some conclusions from those results. I'm not sure the results are there.
Another piece that I saw recently that I thought was interesting was there was a Jacobin piece, which is a very socialist publication. But they were saying that capitalism is making us lonely, which I think is kind of an interesting thought process if you want to kind of take it to its conclusion. In some ways, this seems to be a truth for urban design even. The highest and best use of an allotment of zoning gives us boxes on parcels. So perhaps capitalism is making us lonely, and not just from people working so much, but in that they don't have time for friendships necessarily, but also because of this visual blight. And I'm connecting this kind of to what your research is showing and how people feel when they come into thinking about these boxes, and then how does zoning create these boxes that happen instead of the good neighborhoods and the good design that maybe makes us feel happier.
Well, Jeff, I think it's a great question, but we have to answer this question in light of what's going on with zoning in this country. How California legislature just passed this new bill. I guess the governor hasn't signed it yet and it hasn't gone to conference, but they're talking about getting rid of single family zoning, minimum of 4 units per lot. I think you won't be lonely if you have 4 units on every lot in the state of California. But it's not just there. I think it was Washington State, and where else did I read? In Connecticut, they just passed state legislation in many cities.
Oregon, Minneapolis. Yeah.
Minneapolis, right. So I think zoning is changing. And I think that we're going to start to see an uptick of this. And I think it's going to kind of really provide a different type of answer to your question when this is all said and done. And zoning is not going to be the problem. It's, we're going to be able to start to build more dense communities, and people are going to be closer to each other and not as lonely.
That's interesting, though, because I think even though we might, get more units out of a parcel, you'll still maybe see these boxes on parcels because people are trying to maximize the amount of space that they can get out of a unit. And maybe it's designed more like the boxes rather than like an older building that had some character. I don't know. I'm genuinely curious about how it ends up, but it's just something that came across my mind.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. And I was following very closely what's going on in Connecticut, and so much about it was framed by the Black Lives Matter movement and this racial reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it'll be interesting to see what actually happens, and the impacts of fundamentally eliminating single family detached home zoning in the United States is going to be transformational. I don't know if you know the work of Sonia Hurt. Do you know her?
No, I haven't heard that name.
So she is...
I probably should have.
She's dean of the College of Environmental Design at University of Georgia. But that's not why she's famous. She's famous because, well, she's written a bunch of books, but this one that I'm particularly a big fan of is called Zoned in the USA. And it lays out in real clarity how this single family detached home zoning ordinance that has essentially covers something like 98% of the land area of the United States, the zoning, how it has resulted in the development patterns that we're so accustomed to and that we so, you and I think, so critique. And then she does a nice job comparing it to other countries. But here we are, potentially the end of the zoning. And what is that going to mean for this country and settlement patterns? Really interesting.
Yeah, it's something to be watched. And here in California, we're watching very closely.
Yeah.
Watching very closely.
Right.
Some of your other research focuses on urban growth, decline, change. What's your initial reaction to the census release?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've just started to kind of look through some of the data. What's interesting is you're definitely seeing some substantial growth in cities, and you're seeing the continuation of some of the trends that we've seen. I wrote this book, Sunburnt Cities, so I spent a lot of time looking at the United States Sunbelt. During the Great Recession, there was like a big dip in population, but it's really gone up a lot since then. But yeah, I mean, I think there's so much politics in the census, and that's unfortunate, I believe, because it really, from a demographer's perspective, it is kind of hard to really know how valid and reliable these census data are when compared across the decennial census. So certainly, I mean, I trust that the data that we're looking at today and that will be revealed in the coming months is valid and reliable. Maybe not so much for comparison purposes, given the kind of changes in methodology and question wording that were used in this particular census.
It's really frustrating to me anyways, because my undergrad's in geography, and so I did a lot of GIS data and analysis early on in my career. And, when I learned how to do GIS, the thing that was super exciting was that the census had just come out, the 2000 census, and they had all these new tools to make maps with and to pull it into tables and do all kinds of fun stuff that wasn't around in 1990. And then the 2010 census came out and you could compare the two and you could do all this really cool stuff.
Right.
And it's frustrating to see that maybe this year's will be a little weird for a number of different reasons, whether it's collection or the pandemic or the privacy things that the census has tried to do to hide some populations or to make sure that people feel like their privacy is being respected. It's just, it's an interesting thing for somebody who's spent a lot of time on the American Community Survey and the census website pulling data, frustrating too, to see what might be and what might not be coming out of it.
Yeah. And Jeff, I personally think it's really important to be able to monitor these trends. I mean, it's just for a community to kind of know like where it has been, where it's likely to go. And so you really need that time series data. You need to have those points, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020, you really need that. And that's frustrating for me, not knowing how much confidence we can really have. But I think other people will study this question more closely. And I think we'll have a a better idea. And like you mentioned, the pandemic, that was another, really critical factor. But we don't really know right now how much that data is impacted, but I think we will. I think we'll get a sense.
I'm curious too, from your perspective, another interesting thing that pops up is climate migration and thinking about how people are moving from places like the Midwest to Sunbelt cities, which like you said, you wrote a book about. Now, are they going to move back because of climate change, because of a drought, because of forest fires here in California, et cetera? It's interesting. Is there going to be a mass migration backwards, back to the Great Lakes because there's water there, or the western to the eastern half of the country? I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that too.
Well, I mean, I know the Great Lakes would love it if that was the case. They're rooting for climate change. That's why they're building all those cars. But no, I'm just kidding. Seriously, though, I think that when you look at the climatic conditions at the time of the settling of the Sun Belt, they were so much worse than today, in the sense that they had such a hard time even accessing basic like air conditioning and steady supply of fresh water and electricity. So when we think about some of the challenges that we see today, like you mentioned, whether it's forest fires or drought, certainly those could impact decision making around location. But I'm just saying, let's not forget that these are places that, Arizona, basically the whole state has been a desert for at least a few hundred years, maybe more. So it's always been a exceptionally undesirable place to go, climatically speaking. But, in that desert, there has been the economic investments that have generated employment opportunities and retirement opportunities. Costs are very low, especially compared to California. So I'm not so sure that you're going to see such a drastic change in response to climate. But anyway, that's my prediction.
Yeah, no, I was interested. I was interested in what you had to say.
I guess I could tell you about this really cool project I'm working on. So in addition to, we teach urban planning at Tufts University, where I am, we also have a very well-known law and diplomacy school, the Fletcher. And so I've hooked up some scholars there, and we're working in Central Africa with a unit out of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. It's called the Woodwell Center. And we're collecting data from local partners on hydrology and heat stress, drought. And then the Woodwell people are climate modelers. So they're going to develop some basically GIS maps that are going to predict the future of what's expected there. And then my team, working with Fletcher, we're going to kind of help some of these African cities to develop some strategies to prepare and address changes that are anticipated. So anyway, so it's really exciting. I haven't done anything in Africa before, so wanted to share that.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool. Well, Justin, how can folks find your books or your podcast, or where can we find you online if you wish to be found?
Yeah, so I'm happy. You can just Google me, Justin Hollander at Tufts. You can definitely go to my website. I have a website on university's page. I also have a Substack. Doesn't everybody have a Substack? Isn't that a new rule?
Maybe. I've had a newsletter since 2006, and I guess maybe should I migrate? I don't know. I got the MailChimp. Maybe that's a different thing. I don't know.
It's not. It's the same thing. So.
Awesome. Well, Justin Hollander, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure. Have a nice day.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 15-year-old daily cities newsletter, by going to theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast and our Monday show on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. You can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.
Talk